variety leading to unity. This should be our watchword. We all wish for unity, but we shall not achieve it by emasculated cosmopolitanism. When the union of nations is complete, we must be prepared to offer to the common fund that which we alone can give, that which comes from our own customs, our own history, our own life, the traditional art of our own countries.
It's difficult to sketch a truthful portrait of Ralph Vaughan Williams. There are so many only half-truthful received ideas about him. Vaughan Williams, the jovial countryman; Vaughan Williams, the musical chauvinist; Vaughan Williams, the grand old man, Uncle Ralph. He indeed liked to be called that by his younger friends. Vaughan Williams, the conservative. And there are contradictions as well, even in the first-hand evidence. One tiny example: more than once, close friends of his have described how he'd fix corrections into his scores with sticky tape and then pound the result home with his big fist. He didn't have big fists. He had long and beautifully expressive hands, an artist's hands. We've already had a hint of another only partial truth: Vaughan Williams, the ethno-nationalist, consciously and deliberately distilling his own musical language from a meticulous study of folk song. It was rather more complicated than that. On the one hand, he was using folk song themes in composition exercises for Max Bruch, his teacher in Berlin, long before he had any contact with real folk song. On the other hand, at more or less the same time, when it was suggested that English folk song might be a basis for a rebirth of English music, he was unenthusiastic about the idea. In former times, musical England came to grief by trying to be foreign. No less surely shall we now fail through trying to be English. The national English style must be modelled on the personal style of English musicians. It's important to remember, in fact, that Vaughan Williams didn't really discover folk music when he first heard authentic folk singing on that celebrated 4th of December 1903. He didn't call it a discovery. He said it was like encountering something he'd known all his life. On another occasion, he said he felt like a psychic researcher who'd actually seen a ghost. Even so, it's as well to begin a portrait of Ralph Vaughan Williams with folk song. His widow, the poet Ursula Vaughan Williams.
Mr. Potiphar of Ingrave in Essex, from whom in 1903 Ralph collected his first folk song, Bushes and Briars, said, "If you can get the words, the Lord Almighty will send you the tune." Many years later, Ralph told me that he found it difficult to read any poem without wondering if it would make a good tune. These two suggest, I think, that curious state known as inspiration and the professional attitude of the craftsman, both of which are necessary.
Through bushes and through briars I lately took my way, all for to hear the small birds sing, and the lambs to skip and play, all for to hear the small birds sing, and the lambs to skip and play.
That song, Bushes and Briars, confirmed Vaughan Williams in his belief that the musical genius of the English people, though dormant, was still alive.
Vaughan Williams's friend and colleague in folk music research, Dr. Maud Carpeles.
His love of folk song was bound up with his love of England and the English countryside. But this was not just nostalgic romanticism. He believed that England's greatness lay in the future as well as in the past. And he believed likewise that many of our songs, which had come down to us through past generations, would live on in their own right as supreme works of art. I think that Vaughan Williams showed the humility of true greatness, both in his folk music arrangements and in their use in his own compositions. He thought it no dishonor to speak in the same language as the humblest peasant. Indeed, there are occasional moments when it's difficult to disentangle what is folk and what is Vaughan Williams. One remembers a certain tune in Hugh the Drover. When he was asked whether it was his own or a folk tune, he replied with a mischievous twinkle in his eye, "Well, it hasn't been collected yet."
The name folk song is unfortunate, for it suggests that our national ballads are sung only by a certain class of the community. This is not so. At one time, everybody sang our traditional songs. Every Shakespearean character, from Iago to Stephano, could quote a ballad at request. And you will remember the Squire Weston in Tom Jones, who probably could not read or write, preferred his daughter to play Bobbing Joan on her harpsichord, rather than the latest novelty by Mr. Handel. They belong to us all, high and low, rich and poor, without money and without price. They belong to us who, in the immortal words of Hubert Parry, sing what we like and like what we sing. We, the singing English.
I think one of his very strong feelings was that you should grow from your own roots. And when you have grown to a certain distance from your own roots, you can then explore what's happening everywhere else in the world. Otherwise, you live an orchidaceous life with your roots in the air.
That's firmly attached to its roots, Vaughan Williams' London Symphony. Not, by the way, a countryman's view of London. It was written in London by a Londoner who lived there by choice. Roots in the soil of folk music, certainly, but in the stone and asphalt of the city as well, and in Elgar, and in Debussy, and in Vaughan Williams' teacher, Ravel. Makes him sound an unconventional sort of mystic. Mystic he certainly was, but again, that's only part of the truth. How, to start with, did a lifelong agnostic come to be a mystic, and a mystic who wrote church music, who even became musical editor of a hymn book, the English Hymnal?
It must have been in 1904 that I was sitting in my study in Barton Street, Westminster, when a hansom drove up to the door. It was before the days of taxis, and Mr. Dearmer was announced. I just knew his name vaguely as a parson who invited tramps to sleep in his drawing room, and I wondered if he was going to ask me to do the same. But he had not come to me about tramps. He went straight to the point and asked me to edit the music of a hymn book. I protested, but I knew very little about hymns. You see, I'd been an organist. But he said all the same that my name had been recommended to him, and he told me that there were 8 founders to the hymn book. We gave 8 clerics, and they had between them put down £5 each for expenses, and that my part of the work would probably take about 2 months. After thinking it over for 24 hours, I decided to accept, only to find that the work occupied me 2 years, and that my bill for clerical expenses alone came to £250. In many hymnals, the first idea of the musical editors seems to have been to include as many as possible new tunes by the editor himself and his friends. I myself avoided the specially composed tune, so far as I could. Of course, in the case of a very peculiar meter, this was impossible. I then had recourse to well-known contemporary composers, for choice, not church composers, and the result was some excellent tunes by W.H. Bell, Thomas Dunhill, Nicholas Gatty, and Gustav Holst, among others. I also, contrary to my principles, contributed a few tunes of my own, but with becoming modesty, I attributed them to my old friend Mr. Annon.
Having had a horrible time being an organist in South Lambeth, which he loathed, he realized the very poor quality of music that was dished out every week to people who went to church, whose only music it was, as it was their major emotional experience. He was brought up in a family that read aloud and insisted on church going, so he was subjected to the authorized version and the prayer book all his life, and that is a sonority of English language which is inescapable if it's once in your bones.
It wouldn't be right, then, to call him a secular mystic. He loved and understood the authorized version of the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, the musical and liturgical traditions of the Church of England. The phrase, perhaps, is bourgeois mystic, and he wouldn't have rejected the adjective. Listen to the context in which he himself used it.
A young exquisite once said to me, "I don't like Bach because he is so bourgeois." This was, of course, years ago, while bourgeois was still a term of derision by the aristocracy, and not a term of abuse by the left wing. I answered that I suppose that I was myself a bourgeois of the bourgeois, and I therefore loved his music. Bach undoubtedly belongs to the great bourgeois section of the community. Therefore he belongs to us all. Since there is no longer any aristocracy in this country, and never has been a proletariat, those members of choral societies who sing Bach perhaps have not the exquisite literary taste of our high intelligentsia. The pietism of Bach's texts are not an offense to them, even when they are translated into what the Reverend Dr. Troutbeck imagined was English. Well, the members of our choral societies are not literary experts, and certain words which shock the esoteric sense of literary exquisite pass by them unnoticed. We English are not literary. We are not artistic, but we are musical. His music appeals to everyone, not only to the aesthete,
the musicologist, or the propagandist, but above all, to Whitman's divine average, that great middle class for whom nearly all that is worthwhile in religion, painting, poetry, and music has sprung.
How does it happen that an agnostic, even a mystical agnostic, even a bourgeois mystical agnostic, should have set words like that, a vision from the book of Revelation of the holy city, the life after death? On the half-title of that work, Sancta Civitas, the holy city, there's a quotation which, since it's printed in Greek, isn't perhaps often noticed. It's from Plato's Phaedo, and it reads, "It would not be reasonable to insist that these things are exactly as I have described them, but that these things, or something like them, are true as a description of the souls of men and where they shall dwell after death, especially since it is proved that the soul is immortal. This seems to me reasonable and worth the risk of believing. It is an honourable risk, and a man should sing such things to himself to give him courage." On another occasion, Vaughan Williams wrote, "The object of an art is to obtain the partial revelation of that which is beyond human senses and beyond human faculties. The means we employ to induce this revelation are those very senses and faculties themselves. The human, visible, audible, and intelligible media which artists use are symbols not of other visible and audible things, but of what lies beyond sense and beyond knowledge." Or, as another bourgeois mystic put it, "All things solid in show, not solid be. All things in parables despise not we, lest things most hurtful lightly we receive, and things that good are of our souls bereave." Bunyan, of course, and it's as characteristic of Vaughan Williams that he should claim Bach as a fellow bourgeois as that he should speak of the contemporary that he most revered, Sibelius, in imagery drawn from the Pilgrim's Progress, imagery that we might apply to him, perhaps.
When the pilgrim met Apollyon, he said, "Apollyon, beware what you do, for I am on the king's highway, the way of holiness." This highway, Bunyan tells us, is narrow and as straight as a rule can make it. Other ways are crooked and wide. They lead through bypath meadow, which is easy to the feet, but brings us eventually to destruction. Here the pilgrim will stumble and fall to rise no more. But he who braces himself to ascend the hill difficulty will find himself at last in the haven where he would be.
prelude to Vaughan Williams's opera The Pilgrim's Progress, the hymn tune York answered by, now was it an Amen or an aspiring to what Bunyan saw as the celestial city, and what Vaughan Williams agnostically described as that which lies beyond sense and beyond knowledge. A mystic and a bourgeois. A mystic but a bourgeois? Doesn't bourgeois mean dilettante, amateur? Was he an amateurish composer? He certainly apologized often enough for his incompetence. Well, the appalling untidiness of his manuscripts was less a matter of incompetence than a combination of being forced to write with his right hand as a child, he was left-handed, and sheer urgency of invention. And Roy Douglas, who was invited by Vaughan Williams to wash the faces of his scores, described him as a perfectionist. The face-washing process usually began with an apologetic letter.
Dear Douglas, I have been foolish enough to write another symphony. He then went on to ask me if I would vet the score, which meant correct any small errors I might find, and then either to supervise it being copied by somebody else, or what he really wanted, would I copy it, make a new copy of the score myself. And this was by no means just mere copying, even when I deciphered the notes, because, like other composers, he wrote scores very rapidly, and he made innumerable small errors. As you know, I expect the writing of a full score is a very complicated business and very laborious. And when you're putting these hundreds of thousands of notes on paper, one is apt to miss arco after pizzicato and bass clefs in the cello part after tenor and consordini and senza. And he then used to make changes in the music as he was scoring it. And he would change perhaps a G sharp to a natural in the strings, forgetting that he hadn't changed it in the woodwind. That I had to make lists of that sort of thing and go and see him in Dorking and sort them out. When he got it fairly straightforward as he wanted it, I would then play it to him and to Ursula, and then he'd do some homework on it, and a few months later I'd be asked to play it to what I call the inner circle, 3 or 4 expert friends, Bliss and Rubbra and Finzi and Frank Howes and Scott Goddard. It was terrifying playing them on the piano, because sometimes it wasn't a piano copy, it was more a short score on 3 or 4 staves. And when he'd done his homework, the second time I came to it, there would be bits stuck on crooked with sellotape, and bits written in the corner with arrows, and all sorts of odd things. When I'd played it through, he would ask them what they thought about it. He wanted candid opinions, because he did value other people's opinions on his music, and he had previously had Gustav Holst until Holst died in 1934, and I know he missed Holst very much, very deeply, and he used to ask these friends to say what they thought of the piece.
He would gather 5 or 6 of us together to hear or assess, and by his direct command even to declare an immediate verdict upon the newly created work. Thank goodness, under the alarming threat of a great man's humility, we had one impregnable line of defense, and that was our absolute certainty that nothing we could say would shake or even flutter his own private creative assurance.
It was an assurance, too, that could discover the exact means, however unconventional, of conveying a particular sound quality, as Sir John Barbirolli once discovered at a rehearsal of the 6th Symphony.
Well, you know, at the end of the first movement, there occurs that wonderful lyrical passage for the strings, where he has the first and second violins playing the same tune, but he directs the first violins to play it on the G string, and the second violins at the same octave on the D string. And I must confess, I've never heard the G string of the first violin sound with the clarity and the richness as they did then. So I tackled him about this afterwards, and I said, you know, you always say you don't know much about these things. I said, how did you find that one out? Well, he says, you know, John, I used to play the fiddle once. He said, I was playing Ralph's Cavatina to myself one day. And I found when I got sorry up on the top of the G string, it began to sound a bit wolfy. And there might be a way out of this. Well, he certainly found it at the end of number 6. But I think the most enchanting thing about this story is the picture of V.W. standing up somewhere in a room, and playing Ralph's cavalier on the fiddle to himself.
But Howells called Vaughan Williams's creative assurance included as well an ability to leave gaps in his scores and to wait until the right music to fill those gaps arrived.
He went in for what he called, what you call it was then just temporary stopping. He knew that there would have to be a bit in between this and in between that, both of which he was certain of, A and B. But he would be able to write something down that he knew he would later know what he would put there. Sounds a bit muddly, but that's how it was.
Creative assurance also included an ability to change his mind about how what he wanted to say could best be conveyed. Sir Adrian Boult recalls a case of that in connection with the Pastoral Symphony.
It was actually first heard at a rehearsal of the Royal College of Music's Students' Orchestra, a week or two before the first performance in Queen's Hall. He used to say rather gloomily beforehand that the Pastoral Symphony was in 4 movements, all of them slow. And when the work went into rehearsal, I was continually being told to go faster. I think in every movement. After those first performances, I was away from London, and it wasn't until 4 or 5 years later that he heard me do a rehearsal in Prague. He listened patiently all through, and then said he thought everything was too fast. I ventured meekly to remind him what had happened at the first rehearsal, and his reply was characteristic. "Oh, yes, I know, but you see, I've conducted it myself several times since then, and I find that that slow stuff isn't as boring as I thought it might be."
As we heard, Vaughan Williams himself called the Pastoral a symphony in 4 movements, all of them slow. Philip Heseltine said it reminded him of a cow looking over a fence. In fact, the Pastoral Symphony was almost wholly conceived while Vaughan Williams was with an ambulance unit in France during the First World War. The landscapes that inspired it are as much French as English, and the trenches and the ambulance stations have got into the music as well. That trumpet solo, a sort of last post, evokes the same haunted memories that Wilfred Owen describes. Bugles sang, saddening the evening air, and bugles answered, sorrowful to hear. It is a pastoral symphony, but that's not the whole of it. Vaughan Williams was, at times, a pastoral composer. Wasn't his very first composition, written at the age of 6, a minute piano piece called The Robin's Nest? Isn't the whole of the matter either. There's another characteristic of his that shows a different sort of creative assurance. He liked, so his friends said, to be thought of as a simple kleptomaniac.
He was very keen on the idea of cribbing. He said, if people crib from me, fine if it comes off. If I crib from other people, Beethoven or whoever, fine if it comes off. There are words or sounds that belong to a particular context. And one's use of them is obviously different from the other person's use of them. But ideas start from somewhere, they flow to somewhere, and if you intercept them on the way because you can use them, that's all right.
Even at a party after his 85th birthday concert, indeed, he made this unashamed confession.
Well, I can't tell you what an honour, but rather an alarming honour it is to have this concert of my works, and especially so when I saw old Beethoven frowning some disapproval. The only thing that made me comforted me was that he must have been pleased, I think, when he realized that I had cribbed by Satan's dance directly from the scherzo of his last quartet. If you don't know it, have a look.
There's a good deal of digested and transformed Beethoven in Vaughan Williams. A lot of other cribbings, too. He denied stealing the opening of the London Symphony from Elgar, but he said, my friends tell me it's a compound of Debussy's La Mer and Charpentier's Louise. Elsewhere in his work, he borrowed from his friends, Holst above all, of course, and from his predecessors, Parry and Elgar, from Purcell and from Bach. He adopted formal procedures from Haydn and Brahms as well as Beethoven. He appropriated useful hints, tips and wrinkles from as far afield as Puccini, Hindemith and the dance hall. The range of his cribbings is in fact an index of the range of what he heard and was interested by. Not many composers have listened quite as eagerly as he did to so much music by other composers of all periods, especially his own. On the day he died, he was by then 85, he spent several hours with a young composer who brought some of his own music to play to him. It wasn't just a sense of duty either.
He was very aware of other people's works and very interested in them. He was a very good audience. He was a great opera goer, first nights of new operas, always. And it was a generous interest. I would say it was not a competitive one. He was a very professional person, and you do want to know what your contemporaries are doing, what your younger colleagues are doing. And some of it he found absolutely remarkably interesting. Some of it he found remarkably uninteresting. But he would not have missed it for anything. I don't think he ever thought of himself as particularly old. Every now and again, I mean, obviously, you can't miss a birthday without thinking you've clocked up this number of years. But he was far too interested in the moment, the time he was living in, what was happening in the world. And I think it's very important to remember that at Cambridge he read history, and I think this coloured everything in his life. Gave him a perspective, which I feel is a very important aspect of both his thinking and his writing.
A younger composer, Sir Michael Tippett, has seen how Vaughan Williams himself affected history.
When I was a young, arrogant student, as I certainly was arrogant, in the late 20s, I had the chance to, for example, to go and study with Vaughan Williams and rejected it. I rejected, as it were, all his music as being the generation just above mine, and at the same time I rejected Elgar's music, generation even older. This, it seems to me, was perfectly natural. I think Vaughan Williams would have understood it completely. But I'm less sure that we understood each other without knowing each other in the middle period, when it seemed for a time as though I and others were moving away from his so integral notions of nationalist music, or English music in a nationalist frame, I think this was an illusion. It seems to me now that my music and most of the music of my generation of composers and even later is going to appear and will absolutely English, but in its own time. I am an Englishman of my own time. At the end of Ralph's life, I got at last to know him personally. And this was meant a very great deal to me. I grew to love him. I loved him for his generosity as a human being, for the width of his character, the roundness of his humanity, the wholeness of his personality. And within that love, I realized that all the, so to say, rejections which had come from the arrogance of my youth no longer had any interest or consequence whatsoever. I wanted to accept, and I found absolutely able, naturally, to accept what he had accomplished, both for himself and for us. He had written fine music in England at a time when it had appeared that such music in English language, as he would have said, was impossible, but it was possible. And I think now that through him, as well as through others, but through him especially, we were made free.
Which is why, for those of us who were at that 85th birthday concert nearly a quarter of a century ago, C. Day Lewis's poem addressed to Vaughan Williams, read with such obvious affection by Jill Balkan, seemed effusive, maybe, but not one whit exaggerated.
Old Prospero, you have made for us a brave new world of harmony, where discords are resolved by art, born of true magnanimity. Ageless Ariel, your music will fly on as now it flies, girdling with joy our troubled earth, from Wenlock to the Antarctic skies. Sir, you have many friends. Accept their birthday wish. May God keep safe and bless our 85-year-old Ariel, Prospero, Uncle Red.